Good morning, everyone. Today here we'll be interviewing Dr. Govinda Rao from Brickwork Rating. He's the Chief Economic Advisor. So I just wanted to, we had the budget like last week. So what do you think about the budget? Would you think the budget will push the India Inc. to spend?
I keep mentioning all the time that this budget is like a curate's egg, good in parts. If you really look at the details in the budget document, apart from the 1 lakh crore that is advanced to the states as interest-free loan for 50 years, you do not find a lot more of increase in capital expenditure in other sectors, except in railways and roads. In fact, if you take out that 1 lakh crore, the amount of the increase in capital expenditure is just about, sort of 50,000 crores. Out of that, in addition to roads and railways, is something like 94,000 crore, which basically implies, in addition to that, they have created this Air India Asset Holding Company, and the amount of money that is kept for that is 62,057 crore. So which basically means up to the increase 50,000 crore, and after adjusting for the money given to the states, you have something like 1,46,000 crore only for these three sectors, which basically implies most other sectors, the outlay has come down. Of course, some outlay would have come down because this money that was used for recapitalization last year of something like of recapitalization of banks, additional money given to NABARD, all these things would go. But the real increase in capital expenditure is not as much as it is made out to be if you really look at it, we look at the details. But nevertheless, additional money given to railways and roads is going to increase the demand. And obviously, this 1 lakh crore that is given to the states is also likely to spur demand, but it is not likely to increase the capital expenditure of the state by 1 lakh crore. That is because money is fungible. The states will take that money, and the money they would have spent on capital expenditure, they will substitute that with this. In other words, they may change their own priorities, use this money for capital expenditure, and use the money they used to spend for capital expenditure for whatever they want to do. I do hope they will increase the capital expenditure, and to the extent they will increase the capital expenditure, that also is likely to spur demand. So to that extent, there can be crowding in of expenditures, and in the India incorporated, particularly the construction companies, because much of the money is for Gati Shakti and things like that. The companies like L&T or maybe other construction companies are likely to get more substantially higher demand. But one should not think that this is the be all and end all of growth spurring. So it's only it provides a certain amount of a cushion, and so one has to be a little careful in making an assessment of things.
From what I've understood is that in the budget, we saw that there is only of certain sectors that are going to benefit from the capital expenditure outlay. So this will not, according to you, have an overall impact on the demand. It would have a staggered impact on demand.
There are two answers to this. One is the overall demand is not likely to be very large as it is made out to be. And secondly, the demand will be on basically some of the selected sectors. Of course, particularly in the transportation sector. But there could be spillovers. I mean, obviously, any capital expenditure would have spillovers, because to the extent that this capital expenditure is not used for imports, obviously there will be higher, sort of investment demand in the economy. But I mean, I'm not saying that underestimating the role of things, but then let us not go over, sort of board saying that, oh, we have done it. No, I think there is a lot more that needs to be done to spur the demand, and particularly for the India incorporated sector. Some of the bigger companies are already, sort of in good shape. In fact, the profitability ratios are much higher. For MSMEs, quite a lot of things that Reserve Bank has done in its, relaxing the regulatory compliance. But there will also be some additional sort of demand coming from there. But I think that alone is not sufficient to take the economy to a very high growth path.
So what do you think the government should have also done? What are the other things the factors that you were mentioning to spur proper demand and for India to India to be on its growth trajectory?
There are two things. One is the immediate succor that you need to provide to the entire sections. There has been a very severe cut in the Mahatma Gandhi National Rural Employment Guarantee. Almost 25% has been cut as compared to the revised estimates. Now, the question is that will the assumptions that has led to this compression so hold? Basically, the assumption is that the urban sector will recover fully, and the migrant labor which has gone to the rural sector, which has been using Mahatma Gandhi National Rural Employment Guarantee funds, sort of this thing as a safety net for them, they will return to the urban areas, and therefore the requirement of that particular this thing maybe is less. Will that hold? That's a question. And again, the problem is not so much, if you really look at the national accounts data, there has been a decline in the private final consumption expenditure, even as compared to 2019-20. Now, that's one of the growth engines. So if you really want to increase that, the rural demand has to be improved. There is not much to spur the rural demand. And again, let me also qualify this by saying that, you see, the center's spending, actual spending, is just about 40% of the total spending. 60% of the spending has to come from the states. Now, so obviously that would have much greater impact on the rural areas. But what happens there will have to be seen. So the basic thing is that there is not much in this, because see, you have a situation where, again, the other two sectors where there has been a sharp cut in allocation is food subsidy and fertilizer subsidy. Now, I really do not know what impact it will have on the rural production, agricultural production. It may not have. That's quite possible. But the point is that that much of money, to the extent that money was going to the rural sector, there could be certain amount of problems. So you have the NREGA, which is less, allocation to subsidies, which is less, and obviously we need, and then of course even in the urban areas, the middle class was expecting a lot of concessions. And thankfully, they did not give the concessions. In fact, you see, I would like to say that, you see, cut in subsidies and not sucking into the demand for, sort of reducing taxes is a good move. I mean, I'm not doubting that, because subsidies create a lot of distortions in the system. Instead, you can give cash transfers. And possibly the cash transfer could have been increased to spur demand. That's basically the point that I'm trying to say. So, of course, middle class will always complain. They, because everybody wants the poverty line to be just above his head. But the point is that somewhere along the line, you have to draw a line. There is a lot of scope for rationalizing the taxes. That, in the sense that those two options that have been given, when the rates, lower rates without concession and then higher rates with concession, and minute differentiation in the rates that was done last year could have been avoided. And then you could have said that, you see, we will not give the concession because tax policy is not kamadhenu. You can't achieve hundreds of objectives through tax policy. Job is to get revenue and just do revenue, not go on giving concessions. And then reduce the number of rates, because the best practice approach to tax reform is to have broadened the base, lower the rate, reduce the rate differences, and have simple and transparent tax system. And that should have been followed. But that apart, and again, the subsidy reduction, as I mentioned already earlier, is a good move, but there was a possibility of increasing cash transfers.
So what do you think about the GDP target? Do you think it is achievable, 8.5?
Now, even before the ink was dry, after the first advance estimate came in, they revised the estimate. They see 9.2% is no longer the estimate. If you see, for 2019-20, they reduced the growth rate from 4% to 3.7. For 2020-21, they reduced the compression in growth. That means minus 7.3 was reduced to minus 6.6. If you take that as a base, the growth rate works out to something like 8.8% or something like that. So it's 9.2% is 9.6% is no longer the correct estimate. So, and going further, your thing about 8 to 8.5% that they talk about, and again is an overestimate. It's an overestimate for the reason, apart from everything else. This year's growth, if you see the last 2 quarters, the growth average around 5.6%. The overall, 9.2% they came to was because of the base effect of the previous year in the first 2 quarters of this year. Now that base effect is not going to be there. Now, when you don't have that base effect, if you really want to grow at the rate of something like 8 to 8.5%, you need a full recovery. And quite apart from that, we still have some of the sector, contact-intensive sectors, some not fully recovered. Considering that, I do not really see the economy growing at 8 to 8.5%. It would be anywhere between 7.5 to 8%. This is my hunch. Obviously, sort of in these matters, I think the astrologers are the better predictors than economists.
So, what is your take on the government borrowing target? Do you think the economy is in a comfortable position?
At the moment, the economy is in a comfortable position, and the government borrowing target of something like 14.9 lakh crore. In fact, borrowing is 14.95 lakh crore. There are two things that you need to take care. One is, as I said, I mean, there are two things. In addition to that, there is an increase in states borrowing as well. Out of the 14.95 lakh crore, 1 lakh crore is for the states. Because you borrow and then give it, sort of advance it to the states. And for that reason, the fiscal deficit does not increase to the center. If you really look at it, that 7.2%, for the reduced fiscal deficit to 6 points, the advanced fiscal, the fiscal deficit that they have, this 100,000 crore or 1 lakh crore is not a part of that fiscal deficit. That will become a part of the fiscal deficit of the states. So obviously the advancing is at the cost of the state. In addition to that, the center has promised that they will give some 0.5% extra as recommended by the 15th Finance Commission, if they carry out certain reforms. And some states would. So obviously overall borrowing is more. It's not just, this is only the center's borrowing. Then you need to add the state's borrowing, which would have 0.5% of GDP more. But then on the other side, you can take money from the National Small Saving Fund, depending upon how much of money you have. And, and of course, the Secretary, Department of Economic Affairs has said that he will ensure a growth, smooth process by talking to the Reserve Bank of India. It is going to create pressure, as was revealed by the movement of yield in the bonds. But then I think we will have to see as we go along how things will work. There will also be pressure from, because of the external environment and the interest rates rising in the West. There will be a lot of money flowing back to these countries. One has to see what happens to the bond market in the process. But then this is something which we need to see as we go along. Because the Reserve Bank also will not have much of a leeway, because they have to normalize the liquidity as soon as possible with the type of pressures that is building up.
So speaking of RBI, when do you think they can start normalizing their monetary policy now? When do you think it should be the time for MPC to come back, like for them to hike the rates again, and the economy to come back? When do you think it will be the right time?
On the first part of the question, they have already started normalizing liquidity by mopping up liquidity. Variable reverse repo rate auctions and things like that, they have been doing it. Now, I do not expect in tomorrow's announcement, tomorrow or the day after they have the announcement tomorrow, I do not think they are likely to change the rates. But I think, because for once, the inflation rate is still below the upper band of the target. And two, economy has not recovered. It is still in the process of recovery. And then we are going through there is a declining phase of the third wave of the COVID. So I do not think that there will be, they will continue to mop up, liquidity in the system. But I don't think they will change the rates. But I think if the prices continue to rise, there is also imported inflation because of the oil prices. If the prices continue to rise, I think in the next meeting after 2 months, they will start their interest rate cycle. Because that is the time when, at the moment, it's only Britain which has increased the interest rates. And European Union is planning to. America has not done it yet, but then they will do. When this happens, I think possibly in the next in the next meeting, Dr. Jayant Verma's views will start holding, and they will start the process then. Will it be too late? It all depends on various factors, because food inflation has to come down, and that seems to have come down because the supply shortages in the food and then unseasonal rains and things like that are not a factor any longer. So you have the vegetable price, this thing, meat, all these prices are have declined. So I don't think there will be a serious problem on that. Problem is with the fuel and light. Both the domestic factors, because the coal supply has been a thing, so that has impacted on the power generation, and oil prices are at an elevated level. But then what has happened is that because of the elections, they have not increased the prices of oil distillates. So petrol and diesel prices are still there at a lower level. I mean, at an elevated level, let me put it this way, but then they have not increased it. But I think much of the increase will come after the elections, and that will be the impact will be on the next monetary policy.
So when do you, apart from all of this, like economy is in a bad shape right now, COVID, everything is happening, but then what do you think are the green shoots right now? What do you think can save the economy?
Well, there are some interesting developments. I won't say economy is in a bad shape. Economy is in the recovery shape. I mean, it's recovering.
Okay.
It's still not reached the full capacity, but then there is still a scope for a lot of capacity utilization. Not only because of the demand factors, but there are supply factors. This semiconductor availability, chips, which actually is used across many of these electronic industries. And that crisis is not going to get over, electronic and automobile industry. And that crisis is not going to get over very soon. I mean, you can't generate the capacity, with a sleight of hand. In the January, sales of four-wheelers is 11% down as compared to last year. And this falls across fast-moving consumer goods. So that is an issue which has to be, which will come later. So there will be a lot more of investment on semiconductor facilities. That's a different thing. The other important thing is that banking sector is in a good shape. Some impact of the regulatory compliance relaxations could happen later, particularly on the medium and small scale sectors. But lending to these sectors is not as much as the big industries. So, and most of the large industries have deleveraged their, sort of liabilities, in the sense that they have gotten rid of quite a lot of these things, so cleaned their balance sheets. And commercial lending to the business sector has started looking up. So in that sense, we will continue to have a supply bottleneck in the system. But I think the businesses will start investing now. And there will be sector, particularly the airlines is turning its, turning around, and some of the contact intensive sectors are starting operations better. And then, of course, given the fact that there will be a huge amount of spending on construction sector, both at the center and the state level, there will be a lot more of this thing on the construction industries, steel, cement, and a whole lot of other industries that will come. Pharma is doing well. And so I would say that, economy, the industrial sector in the economy has bottomed out. And, there will be more investments that will come through. And, things will be better. The exports are continuing to rise. If only the government is a little more careful and not go on increasing protectionism in the system, the things will become better. There is also this whole question of production linked incentives. And, I would have preferred them to reduce the tariffs rather than, do this. This is like export incentive. At some point of time, Jagdish Bhagwati seems to have said that it is on this thing he seems to have said, on special economic zones at that time. He said it's always better to have a wall rather than, create some scaffolding in the system. Not in this context, he didn't say that, but then I am saying that, we do need to make the economy much more competitive for longer run productivity growth. And that would require them to reduce the tariffs. Since 2017, we have been increasing the tariffs. That's not good. But then, by and large, as I mentioned, manufacturing sector as a whole, particularly the construction sector, steel, cement, both from railways and additional demand from railways and this thing, and they are likely to improve. And of course, there is a reservation for domestic manufacturers in the defense industry as well. So there are things of that nature. I'm always against reservation for small scale industry and all that, because these are the things where you prevent the small from becoming medium and large, because you give so much of protection to small that at the end of the day, it impacts on the overall productivity in the system. But anyway, the point is, economy has bottomed out, and we are likely to see a better investment climate.
One last question for you, sir. And I just wanted to ask, you mentioned that the banking sector will be one of the sectors that would help the economy right now at its recovering stage. How do you see the banking sector help, and where do you see how do you see it help the economy in general, like the BFSI sector?
It's a tough question, because banking sector's fortunes are better. Whether that will help in lending, because what happens is that interest rates are likely to rise. And when the interest rates are likely to rise, what happens to the demand for credit? Now, economic recovery obviously will depend upon borrowing, and then, obviously there will be better investment climate. And so far, bank was not willing to lend, and borrowers are not willing to borrow. Now the borrowers will start borrowing. And but then the interest rates are likely to rise. But in spite of that, rise in the interest rate will not be very large to begin with. So I should think that the interesting part is, in this year, last year, the government of India put 20,000 crores for recapitalization of the banks. And this year there is no money. So that's because you don't need the money. See, all of them are well capitalized. So you don't really need that money. And most of them are almost all of them are generating profits. So in that sense, and quite a lot of them have been generating profit not from the interest rate margins, but from other, other businesses. But then the interest rate margins, are likely to rise, but there will always be a lag between the deposit rates and the lending rates. And so the margins are likely to rise. And then and if the investor demand is quite high, the investors would not mind borrowing, for the reason that earlier some of the investors used to actually access funds from abroad. Now with the interest rates increasing abroad, they would have to fall back on the domestic credit. So all in all, I think, I mean, if you think that whether we will gallop, I'm afraid not. We will start moving, crawling to a higher, maybe with a slightly higher pace.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.